While various groups in the city and countryside were getting organized and practicing their drills, the governor convinced me to take control of our northwestern border, which was being troubled by the enemy, and protect the people living there by gathering soldiers and building a series of forts. I took on this military job, even though I didn't think I was very good at it. He gave me an official order with complete authority and a bunch of blank officer appointments to hand out to anyone I thought was suitable. I had no trouble at all getting men, and soon had 560 under my command. My son, who had been an officer in the Army fighting Canada in the previous war, was my assistant and helped me a lot. The Native Americans had burned Gnadenhut, a village founded by the Moravians, and killed everyone living there. But people thought it was a good spot for one of the forts. To get there, I gathered the companies at Bethlehem, which was the main settlement for those people. I was surprised to see how well prepared they were for defense. The destruction of Gnadenhut had made them realize they were in danger. The main buildings were protected by a fence of sharpened logs. They had bought a lot of weapons and bullets from New York, and had even put piles of small paving stones between the windows of their tall stone houses, so their women could throw them down on the heads of any Native Americans trying to break in. The armed members of their community also stood guard, changing shifts as regularly as in any military town. When I talked with Bishop Spangenberg, I told him how surprised I was because I knew they had gotten a law passed by Parliament that excused them from military service in the colonies, so I assumed they had strong moral objections to carrying weapons. He told me it wasn't one of their official beliefs, but that when they got that law passed, many of their people were thought to hold that belief. This time, though, they were surprised to find that only a few actually believed it. It looks like they either fooled themselves or fooled Parliament, but common sense, especially when there's immediate danger, can sometimes override strange ideas. It was early January when we started this fort-building project. I sent one group of soldiers towards the Minisink, telling them to build a fort to protect the upper part of that region, and another group to the lower part with the same orders. And I decided to go myself with the rest of my troops to Gnadenhut, where a fort was considered most urgently needed. The Moravians got me 5 wagons for our tools, supplies, luggage, and so on. Right before we left Bethlehem, 11 farmers who had been forced off their farms by the Native Americans came to me asking for guns so they could go back and get their livestock. I gave each of them a gun with the right bullets. We hadn't marched many miles before it started raining, and it kept raining all day. There were no houses along the road to shelter us until we arrived near nightfall at a German man's house, where we all crammed together, both in his house and barn, completely soaked. It was a good thing we weren't attacked during our march, because our weapons were very basic, and our men couldn't keep their gun mechanisms dry. The Native Americans are clever at making things for that purpose, which we didn't have. That day, they ran into the 11 poor farmers I mentioned earlier and killed 10 of them. The one who escaped reported that his and his friends' guns wouldn't fire because the gunpowder in the priming pan was wet from the rain.
The next day was clear, so we kept marching and reached the deserted Gnadenhut. There was a sawmill nearby with several piles of boards left around it, which we quickly used to build ourselves shelters, something that was especially necessary in that harsh weather, since we didn't have any tents. Our first job was to properly bury the dead we found there, who had only been partially buried by the local folks.
The next morning, we planned and marked out our fort. Its perimeter was 455 feet, which meant we'd need that many palisades, tall, pointed stakes made from trees, each about a foot thick. We had 70 axes, and our men immediately started cutting down trees. Since they were skilled with axes, they worked very quickly. Seeing how fast the trees were falling, I got curious and checked my watch when 2 men started cutting a pine tree. In 6 minutes it was on the ground, and I saw it was 14 inches thick. Each pine tree provided 3 palisades, 18 feet long and sharpened at one end. While these were being made, our other men dug a 3-foot-deep trench all around where the palisades would be planted, and we converted our wagons into 10 carts, each pulled by 2 horses, by removing their bodies and separating the front and back wheels by taking out the pin connecting the 2 parts of the main beam. These carts were used to bring the palisades from the woods to the site. Once they were in place, our carpenters built a wooden platform about 6 feet high all around the inside for the men to stand on when firing through the openings. We had one swivel gun, which we put on one of the corners and fired as soon as it was set up to let the Native Americans know, if any were listening, that we had such weapons. And so our fort, if you can call such a flimsy wooden fence a magnificent fort, was finished in a week, even though it rained so heavily every other day that the men couldn't work. This made me notice that when men are busy, they're happiest. On the days they worked, they were good-natured and cheerful, and feeling good about having done a solid day's work, they spent the evening happily. But on our days off, they were rebellious and argumentative, complaining about their pork, bread, and so on, and always in a bad mood. This reminded me of a sea captain whose rule was to always keep his men working. And once, when his first mate told him they had finished everything and there was nothing left for them to do, this type of fort, no matter how basic, is enough to defend against Native Americans who don't have cannons.
Now that we were safely set up and had a place to fall back to if needed, we sent out small groups to search the nearby area. We didn't encounter any Native Americans, but we found spots on the nearby hills where they had been hiding to watch what we were doing. There was a clever trick in how they set up those spots that's worth mentioning. Since it was winter, they needed a fire, but a regular fire on the ground would have given away their location from far away with its light. So they had dug holes in the ground, about 3 feet wide and a bit deeper. We saw where they had used their hatchets to cut charcoal from the sides of burnt logs in the woods. They had made small fires with these coals at the bottom of the holes, and among the weeds and grass we noticed the imprints of their bodies, made by them lying all around with their legs dangling into the holes to keep their feet warm, which is very important to them. This type of fire, managed that way, couldn't give them away by its light, flame, sparks, or even smoke. It seemed their numbers weren't large, and they probably realized we were too many for them to attack successfully. Our chaplain was a very enthusiastic Presbyterian minister, Mr. Beatty, who complained to me that the men usually didn't show up for his prayers and sermons. When they joined up, they were promised, in addition to their pay and food, a small measure of rum every day, which was given to them on time, half in the morning and the other half in the evening. I noticed they were always on time to get that. So I told Mr. Beatty, it might seem beneath your profession to hand out the rum, but if you were to distribute it only right after prayers, you'd have everyone there. He liked the idea, took on the job, and with a little help measuring out the alcohol, he did it well. Prayers were never more widely and promptly attended, so I thought this approach was better than the punishments some military laws imposed for not attending religious services. I had barely finished this task and stocked my fort with plenty of supplies when I got a letter from the governor telling me he had called the assembly and wanted me to be there if the situation on the frontier meant I didn't need to stay any longer. My friends in the assembly were also urging me in their letters to be at the meeting if I could, and since my 3 planned forts were now finished and the residents were happy to stay on their farms with that protection, I decided to go back. I was even more willing because a New England officer, Colonel Clapham, who was experienced in fighting Native Americans, was visiting our post and agreed to take command. I gave him an official appointment, and after lining up the soldiers, I had it read to them and introduced him as an officer who, because of his military expertise, was much better suited to command them than I was. Then, after giving them a short speech, I left. I was escorted to Bethlehem, where I rested for a few days to recover from how tired I was. That first night, even in a comfortable bed, I could barely sleep because it was so different from my rough sleeping arrangements on the floor of our hut at Gnaden, wrapped in just 1 or 2 blankets. While in Bethlehem, I asked a bit about how the Moravians lived. Some of them had come with me, and they were all very kind. I discovered they worked for a shared fund, ate at communal tables, and slept in large dormitories with many people together. In the dormitories, I noticed openings spaced out along the wall just under the ceiling, which I thought were smartly placed for ventilation. I went to their church, where I enjoyed good music, with the organ accompanied by violins, oboes, flutes, clarinets, and so on. I learned that their sermons weren't usually preached to mixed groups of men, women, and children like we usually do. Instead, they would sometimes gather the married men, other times their wives, then the young men, the young women, and the small children, each group separately. The sermon I heard was for the children, who came in and sat in rows on benches. The boys were led by a young man, their teacher, and the girls by a young woman. The talk seemed well suited to their understanding, and was given in a pleasant, friendly way, gently encouraging them to be good. They behaved very well, but looked pale and unhealthy, which made me think they were kept indoors too much or didn't get enough exercise. I asked about Moravian marriages, specifically if it was true that they were decided by drawing lots. I was told that lots were only used in specific situations. Generally, when a young man felt ready to marry, he would tell the elders of his group, who would then talk to the older women in charge of the young women. Since these elders of both genders knew the personalities and characters of their students very well, they were best able to decide which matches were suitable, and their decisions were usually accepted. But if, for instance, 2 or 3 young women were considered equally good for the young man, then they would use the lot system. I argued that if marriages aren't based on mutual choice, some couples might end up very unhappy. And they might, my informant replied, if you let the couples choose for themselves. I couldn't really argue with that. When I got back to Philadelphia, I found that the association was doing great. Most of the residents who weren't Quakers had joined, formed themselves into companies, and chosen their captains, lieutenants, and ensigns as per the new law. Dr. B. visited me and told me about all the effort he had put into making people like the new law, and he credited a lot of the success to his work. I had been vain enough to think it was all thanks to my efforts. However, since he might have been right, I let him keep his opinion, which I usually find is the best approach in such situations. The officers met and chose me to be the colonel of the regiment, which I accepted this time. I forget how many companies we had, but we marched about 1,200 good-looking men, along with an artillery company that had been given 6 brass field cannons. They had become so skilled with these cannons that they could fire them 12 times a minute. The first time I inspected my regiment, they came with me to my house and saluted me by firing several shots outside my door, which shook down and broke several glass parts of my electrical equipment. And my new position didn't last much longer. All our appointments were soon canceled when the law was repealed in England. During my brief time as colonel, as I was about to leave for a trip to Virginia, the officers of my regiment decided it would be appropriate for them to escort me out of town, as far as the lower ferry. Just as I was getting on my horse, between 30 and 40 of them arrived at my door, all on horseback and in their uniforms. I hadn't known about this plan beforehand, or I would have stopped it, as I naturally dislike showing off or being ostentatious on any occasion. and I was quite annoyed by their appearance, since I couldn't stop them from coming with me. What made it worse was that as soon as we started moving, they drew their swords and rode with them unsheathed the entire way. Someone wrote about this to the proprietor, and he was very offended. He had never received such an honor when he was in the province, nor had any of his governors, and he said it was only appropriate for royalty, which might be true for all I know, as I was, and still am, unaware of the proper customs in such situations. This silly incident, however, greatly increased his bitterness towards me, which was already considerable because of how I acted in the assembly regarding his estate being exempt from taxes, which I had always strongly opposed, and I didn't hold back from criticizing his stinginess and unfairness in fighting for it. He complained to the government officials that I was the main problem for the king's service, using my influence in the assembly to block the right way to pass bills for raising money, and he used this parade with my officers as proof that I intended to forcibly take control of the province's government from him. He also asked Sir Everard Faulkner, the Postmaster General, to remove me from my job, but it only resulted in Sir Everard giving me a mild warning.
Despite the constant arguments between the governor and the assembly, in which I, as a member, was heavily involved, that gentleman and I still maintained a polite relationship, and we never had any personal disagreements. I've sometimes thought since then that his lack of resentment towards me, despite the fact that everyone knew I wrote the responses to his messages, might have been due to his professional training, and that, as a lawyer, he might have seen us both as simply lawyers arguing for opposing clients in a lawsuit, he for the proprietors and I for the assembly. So he would sometimes call on me in a friendly way to get my advice on tricky issues, and sometimes, though not often, he would take my advice. We worked together to provide Braddock's army with supplies, and when the terrible news of his defeat arrived, the governor quickly sent for me to discuss how to stop people from abandoning the frontier counties. I forget the advice I gave now, but I think it was to write to Dunbar and convince him, if possible, to station his troops on the frontiers to protect them until, with reinforcements from the colonies, he could continue the mission. And after I returned from the frontier, he wanted me to lead such an expedition with local troops to capture Fort Duquesne, since Dunbar and his men were busy elsewhere. He even suggested making me a general. I didn't think my military skills were as good as he claimed they were, and I believe he was probably exaggerating his true feelings, but he probably thought my popularity would make it easier to recruit men, and my influence in the assembly would help get money to pay them, perhaps even without taxing the proprietor's estate. When he saw I wasn't as eager to get involved as he expected, the plan was dropped, and he soon after left his position as governor, replaced by Captain Denny.